Hello, bonjour. Welcome to our conversation today on Innovating for Impact, Evaluation and Learning in Canada's Skills Ecosystem. I'm Gazella Knight and serve as a policy analyst for the Government and Public Affairs team at Future Skills Centre. To quickly walk us through our agenda today, this will be a 1 hour webinar, beginning with some framing and introductory content to help shape our discussion. We'll then move through a presentation on research findings where we include in-the-field discussion and Q&A, closing with final remarks. To begin, allow us a moment to acknowledge our land. We acknowledge that we're currently on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, also known to some as Toronto. These lands are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The treaties that cover these territories include the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant. As our work takes place across Turtle Island, we also acknowledge that we gather on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play on these lands and commit to learning about our shared histories and breathing life into the journey of reconciliation. Thank you for respecting this shared moment. Now, for a little housekeeping, or as I like to call it, Zoom keeping, I want to remind everyone that today's session will be recorded and a copy will be available to all who have registered. We also want to hear from you throughout the webinar, so feel free to use the Q&A function to comment and ask questions. Please refrain from using the chat function as we've designed this process to be most efficient using the Q&A function. You will see a Zoom toolbar with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our communications team will be monitoring it closely and will do what they do best, connecting with you. A quick reminder that you can listen to the speakers in your preferred language. To select English or French, simply click on the interpretation button in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We're excited to bring your attention to a peer learning group we're hosting with the intention of providing an opportunity for you to discuss how our work intersects through common interests, challenges, and resources. This ultimate goal of peer learning group is to facilitate an open discussion in an informal, safe, and shared space. This is taking place virtually Wednesday, February 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can find the registration link in the chat on the events page or on our website. And to begin this necessary conversation, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tricia Williams, Director of Research, Evaluation, and Knowledge Mobilization here at Future Skills Center. Tricia?
Thanks so much, Gazala. And that mobilization word is a mouthful. So thank you for making your way through it. I'm just thrilled to be here with all of you today and to be having this important conversation. I assume we're all set for the slides and the video, Ellie? Yes. Okay, good. Perfect. So thanks so much for the introduction. Those of you who are on the call know that we are the Future Skills Center. Oh, this is what I was wondering. I was like, why am I not on the screen? But that's fine. Webinar logistics. So Future Skills Center has been around now for almost 6 years. We're very excited that we launched in 2019. A founding consortium, including Blueprint. We're very thrilled to have Karen Myers here with us today, the Conference Board of Canada. And at Toronto Metropolitan University, we have both the center itself, as well as we work closely with the Diversity Institute and Magnet at Toronto Metropolitan University. And we are funded by the Future Skills program through the federal government with a mandate to accelerate innovation and skills development in the face of a changing economy. And this issue is certainly present more than ever now. And certainly we are grateful to the federal government and the teams at Employment and Social Development Canada for having the foresight to invest in discovering solutions and testing and innovating around the future of work. So we invest in new ideas to evaluate and learn. And a lot of times we come to our webinars and our public engagements with the content and the substance of the solutions we're trying to support. And that's really important work. And we're excited today because we want to come to you to talk about some of the learnings and some of the process we've learned in the midst of developing evaluation and learning to uncover those insights in that evidence base. So if we move on, we'll talk. I think we have a couple things to say about our journey. We're really excited that to this date we've supported almost 400 projects. It's very soon to cross that 400 threshold, and that's across all of our work, including consortium activities and different funded pilots that we've supported. We've published a lot of reports. If you want to go to our website, and I'm sure the team will drop some links in the chat. There's a lot of material being shared and posted, so it's a wealth of knowledge and insights for you to take a look at. And we don't represent just ourselves and Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, but we also work with partners across coast to coast to coast in Canada. And that's a big number, a network of partners that are involved in projects and supporting the innovation work underway. So what are we doing at the Future Skills Center? We are just a couple slides to tell you a little bit about the context that we think is so important. So we know that there's a shift in immigration and the labor composition of the workforce. There's also a lot of demographic things at play. We know that there's a big baby boom generation that's getting close to retirement age. Some of them already retired. We know that there's a lot of changes in technology. AI is all the rage. And a few years ago, it was all about data and platforms. We know that technology is changing. We also know that climate is shifting kind of different sectoral opportunities. There's a lot of talk about how we need to grow the electrical grid and we need more workers. And we know that there's shifting opportunities there. But we also know that workplace training is not an even playing field. Canada invests less per worker in workplace training than other peer countries. And we know that certain sectors have higher levels of investment in training, such as financial services or, higher professional jobs than other places. And more than ever, it's very clear that we have changing international trade policy and value chains, and that's shifting the dynamics of what we need from our domestic labor force. So these are a lot of megatrends and shifting conditions. We have identified 5 focus areas that we believe are key to Canada's future prosperity. One is pathways to jobs, making sure that it's very clear and a facilitated process to get people from school into work and to keep learning as they're working. We know that we have to solve the puzzle around digital skills and the technical capabilities that are needed to really leverage technological advancement and automation. We know that small and medium enterprises employ the most Canadians in the private sector workforce in Canada, and they may not even have an HR team or have the spare funds to invest in a large scale training program. So solving that will be really key to Canada and the workforce challenges we have. We know that an inclusive economy is more important than ever, and making sure that everyone has access to opportunities to thrive and learn in their future. And lastly, we know that sustainable jobs is going to be a key part of the picture for how we reach our climate targets and how we make sure that we have the workforce needed to drive meeting our target emissions. So, all that to say is now we get to talk about how we're doing all that. Look under the hood. I hope there's lots of data nerds on this call, just like all of us here. And I think some of us self-identify that way. But when we published a state of skills brief today as well, I'm sure they'll drop the link in the chat. And one of the things we talked about is how at the beginning when we started out, we were trying more or less to have a standardized approach to measurement for good reasons. There's a lot of interest in, measuring things consistently for comparability purposes, and where possible, we absolutely want to do that. But one of the things we found a lot of value in was standardizing some of the socio-demographic indicators so that everyone is tracking using the same kind of categories as we track. Now, some of that is done for us by our government partners who say, these are the things we're interested in. We want to make sure we measure things in this way. And same with employment statistics. There are some standardized measures that can be used and that we employ wherever possible. But increasingly, we also wanted to look at participant satisfaction and their experience in a program. So what is the user experience in a program, and how can we consistently capture that? One of the other, I think, big innovations and things that we did differently, which I hope Karen will tell us more about, is really looking at the outcomes. So not just looking at how many people finish a training program, but what happens when people leave a training program, and how can we really use that to assess the effectiveness and the strength of a certain model or approach. So we started out with very good intentions to try to measure things consistently. One of the things we did find, however, is that not everything is necessarily geared towards individuals being trained in a training program. So maybe before I talk about this slide, I'll just say that, a lot of times we found ourselves supporting a variety of different kinds of interventions. So for instance, you might be developing a curriculum, or you might be targeting a policy change, or working on network alliances, all things that are really geared towards supporting the skills system to do better. Eventually, the theory goes is that those would lead to better individual outcomes. But in the short term of measuring that program success, it was more difficult to use standardized measurements for the different kinds of interventions. We did find that many organizations in our network are eager to measure and learn, including post-secondary institutions. No, actually, if you go forward one slide, thanks. There was a lot of capacity and interest in learning, a lot of enthusiasm, and frequently proposals come to us and they have research involved and they have evaluation involved, and we see that hunger to learn and understand what organizations are doing. But we also found that it's hard to talk about the things that aren't working, and especially even with a funder with innovation in our DNA and in our mandate, it's still hard to talk about the things that aren't working. There is that desire to talk about the innovation that's successful. And I'd like to say, if 100% of our innovations are successful, then we're probably not being innovative enough. And I think the private sector knows this. The private sector knows that all innovation isn't going to work. There is an accepted kind of level of failure, or saying that's okay, not everything is going to work. But we still struggle a little bit to find the right way and spaces to talk about that openly. If we keep going one more slide. One of the things we talk about this in more detail in the paper we released today, and but one of the things we realized is that the partners that had really strong evaluation support, such as through Blueprint, and Karen will talk about how they're working with partners in the FSC portfolios and partners working with Diversity Institute, they had much stronger strength of evidence and data that they could provide to FSC. So we started to hire more external evaluators to work one-on-one with project partners. And those evaluators would work directly with the project partners to develop evaluation plans and to put things into a framework for evaluation that made sense and helped us assess an intervention and work with the partners. We would offer feedback on the frameworks and the reports, but really it was about building that relationship between partners and the evaluators. And we've more or less made that a standard part of our kind of expectations for innovation projects that are supported through our work. If we go on one more slide. Yes, and I think this is something that Andrea will share more with us about, but we were also very interested in the projects that wanted to work with Indigenous lenses on evaluation. And we obviously worked with Andrea Johnson, who will speak shortly, but we had other projects who had hired their own Indigenous focused evaluators. And we saw a real value in embracing these frameworks that value process, relationships, and spirit, and that could, define outcomes from a community perspective. And we're also trying to say, what can we take from those experiences that can apply to all of our collective evaluation practice? And we look forward to hearing more about that from Andrea. If we go on to the next slide, I'm going to leave you with a few takeaways before my time is up, and we'll get into it more in the discussion. But one of the things I think we saw was a range of evaluation capacity. And sometimes you'd say, oh, we'd expect a smaller community organization, for instance, to have less capacity to look at evaluation. But sometimes it actually was surprising that you might have a large, robust post-secondary institute who had very strong research capacity, but didn't really know how to put that in an evaluation lens, or were looking, perhaps at a very interesting funding related research question, but wasn't looking at the whole initiative or the intervention or model as a whole. And so we saw quite a bit of confusion about evaluation of research that persists. And part of what we try to do is help clarify that and support, a more holistic view of evaluation through our support. We still struggle with this resistance to acknowledge failure, resistance, or finding the right way, language and terminology. And in this way, I think we'd be very interested in hearing from people on this call and in the peer learning group. How can we create the space to talk about this openly? How do we create that environment? And to our funding partners in government agencies and foundations, how do we create that open space for that? We really continue to be challenged by funding timelines. So short programs with short durations of implementation are really only going to be able to look at outputs. And that limits our ability to really assess whether the models or the interventions are having the kinds of outcomes that we theorize about and that we hope come about. But so we really need a long-term commitment to skills piloting and testing to really assess outcomes. And then lastly, I think we continue to see a need for more robust inclusion practices and integrating inclusion and looking at different experiences throughout evaluation and learning. So for instance, that starts very simply at disaggregating data and looking at who is this program working for, or who is it not working for? Are there patterns in who's dropping out and why? And taking a very inclusion-oriented lens to how we look at programs. So I think that's my last slide. Oh, I got one more. Okay, so a couple things that we're doing in our work at Future Skills Center. One is we are starting right from the outset of including strategic questions in the funding proposal. And we recently closed some open calls, and we included that in the very questions and saying, what are we testing? What are we trying to learn through this proposed project? And we are also searching for that balance between consistent and customized bespoke measurement. As I mentioned, we are trying to, apply consistency wherever possible, such as tracking different demographic characteristics, and also looking at certain consistency of outcomes, for instance, for individuals in jobs. We also want to require third-party evaluation, and that's now part of our funding calls. And we say, you will be working with a third-party evaluator, whether it's Blueprint, Diversity Institute, or one of the other evaluation firms that we work with. We are really focused right now on continued support for project partners and evaluators, including guidelines and templates, but also the learning processes. So how can we come together regularly to talk about how this is working? So for instance, we recently surveyed some of our project partners about their experiences working with evaluators to make sure that we were doing our very best to make improvements as we're going in that process. And lastly, we want to expand our evaluation roster. We realize that different evaluators bring different skill sets and approaches, and we want to leverage a variety of evaluation capacity to work with different kinds of partners, project partners. Okay, that is really going to be my last slide. And I'm super excited, thrilled actually, that we have two very trusted and leading partners of Future Skills Center who've done so much of the work in this area, including Andrea Johnson, who's the CEO of Johnson Research, has worked very closely with some of our Indigenous focused projects. And then Karen Myers, who is an instrumental part of setting up the Future Skills Center and leads the work at Blueprint, and has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with us about Blueprint's approach to generating evidence and supporting partnerships. So each of them are going to take a few minutes to outline some of their approaches that they've used, and then we'll have a discussion. And I'll keep my eyes on the Q&A, so feel free to pop in questions, and then we'll make sure we have some time for that at the end. So I'll hand it over to Andrea first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tricia, for that introduction. Really glad to be here today. We had such a great time working with Future Skills. They were such a well-set team, very supportive. The meetings that we had with them were very productive. We really were supported by Future Skills Center in doing this evaluation work. Um, and it was a fantastic partner to have. We had about a dozen projects across Canada, east to west, north to south. Um, we worked as far as BC and as north as Nunavut. So the focus of the projects included applying community-based approaches aimed at advancing the skills. Some of the projects were early stage businesses. One of those was in the Yukon, and they had really found out very quickly how to respond to community needs. And that was a very excellent example of bringing in cultural knowledge from the beginning in their project. We also worked with an organization out in the East Coast who had Indigenous-based training and job placement. It was an Indigenous organization working with Indigenous communities, and they had a lot of success with the future skills. We both worked with Indigenous-led projects and non-Indigenous-led projects. One of the non-Indigenous-led projects we worked with was very receptive to us in terms of wanting to know what are their next steps. They had originally thought they would do some research. A lot of times people think, okay, let's go to the community, let's talk to the community members and do the research. But what was learned through the Future Skills Center, because of the work and the support, and she worked very closely with Future Skills on this approach and decision making. And because of all this camaraderie, we were able to support her through Johnson Research in looking at not surveying the community members. A lot of the questions that were drafted, and we talked to a lot of other people, and they'll say that they do run into this when they do engage with Indigenous people, that the questions are traumatizing and they do that indirectly, but we have to be very, very careful with survey questions. And rather than risking engaging with community members and traumatizing them, what we had suggested is they'll be better off talking to the service providers, the workers. A lot of times workers in Indigenous communities are actually past clients themselves. So you're getting a double tiered benefit. You're getting their experience and knowledge working with the Indigenous community members, but as well as the fact is that they had probably used the services themselves. So one of the projects reported to us, I'm so glad our paths have crossed. I want to thank you for support and insight as we work to have navigated this project. As a result, our project is continuing its search for secure new dollars to support the continuation of the program that we had started in northern Manitoba. They had learned a great deal about the program and the best approach to implement. We got there in part because of your support. This was very rewarding project to work on. And I have to say, it has a lot to do with future skills and the mechanisms that they use. Next slide. This is a picture of them working up there in the paw. This was so rewarding to see this happen. So what they had ended up doing through their research project, talking to the community service providers, is that instead of designing this program as yet another activity that parents would have to schedule and get their kids to, the biggest learning that they had learned is that they are, say there's a Mums and Tots program already existing, then they will enter into that Mums and Tots program during that scheduled time slot. So parents are getting more bang for their buck. They're going to Mums and Tots, they're socializing with other parents, and their kids are learning these very important skills at the same time. So now we're able to see more benefit all in one. Another exciting thing we got to do was work with a tool that we had developed. And this tool was developed through a lot of research, working with topical interest groups, and also in terms of working with communities directly. We were able to develop a model of evaluation that has 4 pillars now: spirit, relationship, and process. The 4th pillar is a new. We haven't done any pilots with it. That's why it's in yellow, but I am sharing that here today. And so far, all of the talks we've had with community members, they're very supportive of this 4th pillar, which is the unknown. A lot of times we go into program service delivery, program design, and we think we have everything figured out. And that's what logic models do. They assume what are all the answers ahead of time. But time and time again, working with Indigenous communities, we always hear this, that there is a need to pause, to take time to breathe, take time with the land. Always when you go out in the land and the water is a time when you can explore what is the unknown. It'll be revealed to you by spending time in nature. Next slide. So some of the learnings, FSC asked us, well, what were the learnings that came out of the projects? This was a very good question. And it led us to exactly pause again and stop to think is, what have we learned? It was very exciting. I'm just going to read these bullets because they are so impactful. The positive impact of using Indigenous ethical principles and knowledge translation in research and evaluation. Supporting community needs and uphold the notion of nothing about us without us. Support the team in ensuring the program is relevant and sustainable within the community served. The importance of building pride, knowledge of the types of Indigenous industries that students can aim to work for, and improve outcomes and understanding among Indigenous youth and academics. Include Indigenous culture, crafts, land-based learning, particularly in person. Don't reinvent the wheel, work with pre-existing program when you can. Really, based on our experience, this is almost a checkbox recipe for success. This has a lot of the indicators that were important in this list here, and I think there's a lot that can be learned from this. Do I further developed required? So some of the FSC projects wanted to look at community members carrying out the work, understanding community capacity and resources to demonstrate appropriate supports and services. That was really critical when I was talking about the Yukon project, because what they had actually done is they got out into the communities, and because they were willing to listen, instead of, they were actually in an academic institution. So normally what they do is they design their work plan in-house and then they implement. Well, when they got into implementation, they hit a roadblock, but they didn't, ignore the signs. They responded immediately. And what they ended up doing was hiring local community members to deliver the programs. And what they allowed the local community members to do is design the work plan essentially themselves within their community setting. So lastly, I would just say here the importance of soliciting feedback and taking time to consider it without bias. And then again, additionally, listening to what people have to say builds connections, and those connections can benefit the program and participants in the long run. We heard that time and time again from all of these projects. Thank you. Well, I think I ran out of time, didn't I?
Yeah, I think that's great, Andrea, and maybe we can catch up more
Can
in
you share
the.
those 2 slides with everyone? What we missed was the OCAP and the data sovereignty, and I think those could just be an FYI by taking some time to read those slides on your own.
Absolutely. We're going to send out to everyone a recording of the webinar and the slides. So I know that question has come in the chat as well. So there's lots of great information here. And I might want to ask you a question about that if we have time. So, but we'll turn it over to Karen Myers now, who's the CEO of Blueprint. And as I said, Blueprint's been such a tremendous founding partner of Future Skills and does a lot of really great work with a lot of our project partners. So over to you, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Andrea. That was just so interesting, and I really like that the journey map and thinking about that with the pillars, especially the unknown. So thank you for sharing that. So hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I lead Blueprint. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping decision makers use evidence to improve policies, programs, services, and to make life better for people in Canada. So today I'm going to be talking about some reflections on the evidence work we're doing through the Scaling Skills Up initiative. Through this initiative, we are working with 10 promising training solutions that have been selected from the Future Skills Center's innovation portfolio. So our goal with these solutions is to look at how we can scale them to meet the needs of people in Canada. And we do this using an integrated evidence toolkit that includes rigorous measurement, but also continuous learning. That part is really important, and really investing in performance improvement so that every program can be as strong as it can possibly be. We also look at long-term outcomes tracking and, where possible, using data to look at the return on investment. So moving on to the next slide, I want to say a little bit about the problem that we are trying to solve with this portfolio. And this problem is really twofold. So looking first at the left side of the slide, what we really are doing with this portfolio is contributing to a future state vision where we have a robust skills marketplace where every person in Canada can confidently navigate their training options, find the right program at the right time, and know that it will work. And of course, what we're working on is the know that it will work part of it. And then on the second side, second challenge, moving to the right side of this slide, we're also really focused on addressing challenges associated with scaling. So Canada invests pretty heavily in pilot projects to test new ideas, but the challenge is that most actually fail to grow beyond small-scale pilots, and we call this problem the stagnation chasm. So moving on to the next slide, to address this chasm, we have come up with an evidence approach that is aligned to the stages in the innovation cycle. So starting at the beginning with concept generation, prototyping, then moving to delivery and iteration, then to scaling and systems change. So when we began, we selected the 10 training solutions that we believed were strong candidates for scaling. What we quickly learned is that for these programs, we would have a much higher probability of success if we invested more in stage 4, which is delivery and iteration. So what do I mean by this? Ensuring that a program is as strong as it can possibly be before scaling is really crucial. And it's not something that funders spend a lot of time thinking about in a traditional sense. So, because it's not how many people you train, it's whether the training actually makes a meaningful difference in people's lives. So really thinking about what works for whom and under what conditions, but not in a reactive sense, but in a very purposeful sense. So we need purposeful attempts to make programs as effective as they can be. So moving to the next slide, within stage 4, we broke programs out into 3 groups. So the first group, 4A, the implement stage, this is the stage for organizations that are implementing a relatively new intervention. For example, one that's based on strong evidence, but adapted to a new population group. And we had a couple of organizations that fell into this category. Here, the focus is on collecting and analyzing data to support the establishment of a repeatable model. The next stage, the improved stage, this is the stage for interventions that have been operating for a while. And here the focus is on using data to optimize program design and delivery. This is the stage that we are most excited about because few organizations actually get funding to be able to use data and evidence to make their programs better. So this is really, really important. The next stage, the prove stage, this is for mature interventions. And here the focus is on rigorous evaluation to demonstrate impact, preferably using random control trial designs. It is our experience that too many organizations are asked to move to this stage too soon. People that are implementing interventions for even the first time sometimes are asked by funders to demonstrate impact. And what I really want you to take from this slide and from our work here is that when it comes to generating evidence, it's really important to walk before you run and to crawl before you walk. And in this way, we don't really think of it as resistance to admitting failure because we don't think about things in a binary thumbs up, thumbs down kind of way. And in fact, what's really important to us is investing in capacity building and purposeful attempts to make programs the best that they can be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the RCTs, but I really don't want us to lose sight of the importance of the implement and improve stages. So moving to the next slide, quick note about RCTs. So you can advance to the next slide. We've got, or actually, sorry, go back one slide. RCTs are often referred to as the gold standard for training programs, and they do really help us understand impact and what works for whom. However, they are not suitable for interventions as they are developing, and it's important to invest in nurturing innovations. We've currently got 3 programs where we are evaluating them using an RCT design. So those programs, I don't think I'm going to have time to describe in detail, but they're all doing very, very different things with different population groups. However, we're trying to use as standardized an approach as possible to allow us to aggregate the results. So we can move to the next slide. Tracking long-term outcomes. I saw a few things in the chat about long-term outcomes. This is really critical to our approach, especially with training programs. It takes time to see outcomes emerge for participants. So we might see evidence of an employment impact in the short term, but typically for earnings, that takes some time for us to develop. So that's why our partnership with Statistics Canada is really essential there. And we're using the social data linking environment to track long-term outcomes for participants. This also allows us to look at some non-economic measures as well too. We're also in conversations with the SDC about how we can use their administrative data to help us build out the outcomes that we are tracking. So ultimately, these insights are going to help us make smarter investment decisions and help us really improve the quality of delivery across the country. So I have some lessons learned that I'll come back to in the panel discussion. So I'll pause and leave it there for now and turn it back to you, Tricia.
Thanks, Karen. That's such a, I know it's hard to distill years of work into a few minutes, but lots of juicy things for us to jump into there. Maybe let's start with, thanks to everyone. Thanks to both of you, of course, for first of all, being such valued partners of Future Skills and utilizing your respective skill sets and organizational capacities to advance this work. A great distillation of what I said of relying on different skill sets and capabilities. So maybe let's start with this question. I think a very interesting question came in, and this might give you a little bit of chance, Andrea, to talk a little bit about how you've worked with a variety of organizations. I echo Karen and really appreciating um, the the framework that you brought to this work and that you were able to develop, and we really saw the value of that in how it was applied with different partner organizations. And the question is, how can Western and Indigenous evaluation perspectives be effectively bridged when evaluating impact of a project or initiative? What's your thought about that, Andrea?
I would say that's really up to the communities. It should be left that way, what their comfort level is. Certainly, we've worked with a number of communities. I can remember one, especially in the Yukon several years ago. They were very much supportive of Western-based approaches and evaluation, but they also wanted to balance that with culture because they had their own Indigenous governance. And as well, it would also depend on the population base of the communities. Some communities, they may have around 500 people on reserve, for example, and they may only have 10 births a year. So if you were doing a health study, 10 births a year doesn't really cut it for saying you can do any statistics on those births. But however, Six Nations of the Grand River is the largest First Nation in Canada. Next is Akwesasne, and those are both in Ontario. And they do have the numbers for running statistical analyses. But again, it doesn't matter who has the numbers, who doesn't have the numbers. It really needs to be left up to the communities. And with data sovereignty and OCAP coming into more recognition, we are finding more communities are having review boards in place for research, and they're making their own decisions on what methods would be used.
Such a great point, and I wonder too if part of this is if we could create space for having different ways of showing impact, right? Including qualitative ways, and
Yeah.
there's so many abilities to synthesize qualitative impacts now that weren't maybe available to us in the past. Yeah. Karen, you mentioned I loved your part about crawling first, then walking, then running. Not everyone has to show outcomes. How are you able to balance that continuous improvement and figuring out what isn't working as well as what is working at those kind of earlier model development stages?
Well, I'd say we always encourage collecting data, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, and using a variety of different approaches as appropriate, but always encourage organizations to collect data about outcomes because that's how we know, right? And whether that's by talking directly to participants and encouraging constituent voice, because sometimes we think something is working, it feels like the right thing to do. We're used to telling our funders that things are working, but in fact that there are pieces that aren't quite adding up or making sense, or something that we designed is not working as we intended it to work. So it's really important to know that. And it's really important to know that before we move to measuring impact. We need to know what are the parts of the program. How do we expect that they should unfold for participants? And is that actually what's happening? And how does that differ, right? And how is it changing over time? So it's really important to understand that. Otherwise, we can end up making assumptions. And there's so much pressure across the country to tell good news stories about what's working. And that doesn't necessarily honor the people whose time, the people who are investing their time and investing their hope in the program. So really helping to understand what is actually happening for people participating in programs is really, really critical.
I love that point. It's so true. And I think that's what we're trying to say in probably a little provocative, shocky way about failure, but it isn't necessarily about failure, right? But it is saying what
Yeah.
is working. So
And
how
I
how do
really
we share that? Yeah.
I really would reframe it away from failure to be really giving voice to participants, not to tell your good news stories that you can shop to your funder, but to really explore what's working for them, what's working less well for them, right? Where do people make progress? Where do they falter? And where do we want to put investments, purposeful investments in making things better? If there was one thing that I could change about how government funding is invested in programs, in addition to providing more long-term, more secure, and fully loaded costs, it would be allow organizations to get better at what they are doing, right? Because that also changes over time. It's not static. It's not like you're going to get a gold star and then you're good, right? Needs are changing, labor markets are changing. So purposeful attempts are so, so important.
So Andrea, in our prior discussions, you talked so much about, the capacity that you saw organizations bring to this and the passion. So can you speak to that at all? Like how did organizations, what in that asset-based approach, what did they bring to the table that impressed you?
Well, from the non-Indigenous organizations, I think that was more of the sort of really shocking understanding that they could actually come to an understanding, and how they could work well with the Indigenous communities. I think that's the big shock to Indigenous people, is when a non-Indigenous organization would be successful at delivering services to where the Indigenous communities are embracing them as a service provider. So I think that's the shocking side of it. The not the Indigenous service providers, there was really just a no-brainer to it because they knew how to work with the communities already. So I think that's where the lessons can be learned, is for the non-Indigenous service providers. And in that case, I would say, what is a gold standard of working with Indigenous peoples? The Yukon example that I talked about earlier is the gold standard. They had taken the time to research what is Indigenous cultural competency training, and they actually landed on a very comprehensive cultural competency training. They engaged in not just a one-day training. This was very intense, very committed. All of the team members completed the training. They completed the training together, and they had done it with their willingness to do it. And afterwards, you could see the benefit because they had basically adapted their service model to the extreme, to the community's needs and priorities. And they had done a stellar response to what those needs were.
That's amazing. That's a great example. Um, I want to turn a little bit to, you're both practitioners, you both run firms in the evaluation and learning space, supporting organizations, you have ideas about what's needed. What did you learn in your own practice as your own organizations through your engagements? Like what have been some of the takeaways for you, both individually, but as well as, in your organizations that you lead, in your leadership journey over the past few years related to evaluation and learning? Do you want to start, Andrea?
Yeah. The model that I had showed, actually, I was running out of time, so I didn't go into a lot of detail in it, but it's called the Awakening the Journey Vision model. And like I had said, it was developed over time and with a lot of partners and a lot of input. And we were at the early stages of piloting it. We had completed 1 year of demonstration projects when we met up with FSC. And so applying that model across all of the approximately dozen projects that we worked with was a huge learning for us, because we were actually quite surprised that everyone adopted the model for their evaluation that we worked with. So we initially designed our approach to have a startup meeting with each project. In that startup meeting, we would ask them what their needs and priorities were. And we would also ask them if they wanted to learn a little bit about our tools and approaches. So when we did that, everyone wanted to get on board and apply the model in their setting. So that was a huge learning for us, because we, like I said, we were quite surprised at the uptake, and we were very interested to see how the model played out in the different settings. And so all of that was a learning journey for us.
Thanks. Karen, what about for you?
I think one of the most interesting things for us, and I've spoken a little bit about this already, we designed the 3 stages with real intentionality of really not wanting to rush organizations to measuring impact. It was really hard to explain and communicate why, especially the improve stage, was so important. It's not what organizations typically hear from evaluators, because they typically hear either the thumbs up, thumbs down, or developmental evaluation, where we're not talking about outcomes at all, right? And here we are talking about outcomes, and we're measuring outcomes, and we want to move towards more rigorous evaluation, but we want to give a lot of space and time to that capacity building piece. And organizations were really not sure if they wanted to hear that from their evaluation partner, right? And we're like, we're not your evaluation partner, we're your evidence partner. And we need evidence at all stages, right? And there are different types of evidence. So that was getting good at having those conversations and thinking about what is needed to build trust, right? And because, relationships only work at the speed of trust, and a relationship is really important here. So that was a learning on how to do that. And even among my own team, right? It's a new way of thinking about things. So that was a pretty significant learning. And I see there's a question about the StatsCan linkages, and I'm happy to speak to that too, if you would like, Tricia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go for it. I was gonna add maybe just one moment before that. I was gonna say
Sure.
one of the things at Future Skills that was also so prevalent in our practice recently has been, helping organizations, distinguish between when there's research to understand a problem or to lay out kind of the issue and how that's connected, but also different from looking at the whole intervention and thinking about how do we assess progress and as we go. But yes, there is a question about StatsCan, about the data linking that you've done and that's underway, and any suggestions you have about how we can better use StatsCan data in evaluations.
Yeah, so I can say I'd be happy to. Please reach out to me if you would like to discuss, because it's actually a very challenging process. It's an extraordinary opportunity because there's data there. We can use the tax data and look at earnings, right? We can look at earnings trajectories before people come into an intervention. We can look at them afterwards, and we can look at people's sequencing of interventions. So the doors it opens are outstanding, but it is not easy to do. There isn't there isn't an open door for nonprofit organizations at this point in time to use. It took us, even working with the Future Skills Center, and we were really, really grateful to have the opportunity to do this, but even doing that, it took us 2 years to get the agreements in place. But as a result of having those agreements in place and setting up an approach for nonprofits, we now have a new agreement with Statistics Canada to replicate. And so we are looking for organizations who want to participate in the next stage of this pilot. So please reach out, and I'm happy to share our experience. There are academics that can do it, but you have to find them. So that can be challenging as well too.
Do a whole webinar just on
Yes.
SATS-CAN linkage. So,
Yes.
yes.
So I'll leave it there, but please do reach out.
Yeah. So maybe I'm going to end with one question, the last one that came in, which I think is especially we're here at skills development, we're thinking about organizational capacity. Petra writes, they're seeing funders invest less and less and remove entirely funding for external evaluation. How do you think organizations can build capacity to learn from programs? What advice do you have in the climate of that? I know I have some ideas, but I'll maybe start with both of you and what ideas you have in kind of in light of maybe reduced funding for evaluation funding. Who wants to start? Andrea? Okay,
Yes.
go for it.
Actually, that just came up today in my earlier meeting today. And working with Indigenous communities, we heard from one of the Indigenous service providers here in Ontario had expressed their concern and their ideas. And then that had actually put on a light bulb in my head. And then I proposed the idea back to the group, and they all endorsed this idea. And so we ended up dreaming up this idea today, but actually I think it's very relative and very supportive of this concern, is that to have the intervention have a type of toolkit for having the program participants act as the researchers. And so you could actually look at, some kind of benefit to them for doing this. But as you so this intervention that we were working with, they would take in different cohorts over time. And so each cohort could feasibly be approached and say, hey, does anyone in this cohort, and these are program participants, want to act as the researcher throughout this cohort? And so there'd be a toolkit available to them. So it's kind of like an ABC for them to follow. How do I do research, and how do I analyze the information into a report? And giving them tools. And one of the tools we're actually going to share is an Indigenous-based tool, as well as the idea of doing surveys. Maybe they want to make up their own questions. And so then they would actually research the other program participants during that service delivery cohort. And so then that would be a way of doing quality assurance for the program, because you're not acting passively. What is the feedback? What is the input? Oh, we have a feedback box over here.
Yeah.
Whoever submits the survey into the feedback box. But now they're being proactive, and as well, they're giving new tools and benefits to the program participants through this process, as well as learning themselves what are the ways in which they can grow and develop as an organization through each cohort.
Love that. Love that integration idea. Karen, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the idea of using peer researchers is a really good idea, and we have used that in a number of projects. I think there's things that an entity like the Future Skills Center can do to improve the way the sort of evaluation marketplace, so to speak, works, right? By having rosters of evaluators and information about their approaches available, and having some open source tools and so on, right? That makes it easier for organizations to find evaluators that suit their needs and ways of working, right? So that kind of can increase the value and keep the cost down, right? Because it's very hard to find each other, right? And you spend a lot of time sort of getting to know each other and writing that proposal and so on. There's lots of uncertainty on both sides. And then, before you know it, your project's over, right? And so I think helping people find each other, get to know each other, and building that culture is, I think, another great way as well, too. And we also got to get the word out to funders about how
Yeah.
evaluation is important and how you can use that information, act on the information that you find.
Yeah, I would echo all of those ideas and, integrate it with program delivery, right? So data collection, monitoring, it's part of delivering a program. So it's not some separate budget line item. It can be absolutely integrated in how you deliver programs, and that should be very clear to whoever is supporting your programs. All right, I have to turn over to Gazala to wrap up here, and I'm excited to continue the conversation more. And thank you to both of you for coming and sharing your wisdom and expertise with all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. Yes, just to end well, I want to thank this very community present here today, from our communications and interpretations team to our speakers, and most importantly, to all of you in attendance who have taken the time to establish the importance of our collective work that now transcends through your professional and personal path of innovating for impact. We truly want to know what you thought about today's webinar and ask for just one more moment to complete the survey that will pop up at the end of our webinar. To quote one of Andrea's key learnings, "Nothing about us without us." With that shared intention, we look forward to strengthening our work together by bringing us together again, and hope to see you in our peer learning group. Again, that's next week, Wednesday, February 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, take good care.